Hello to everyone online tuning in. My name is Nancy Friedman, and I'm on the board of directors of the 92nd Street Y, and I'm an advisory committee member for the Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact. Just in time for Women's History Month, the Belfer Center is proud to bring you this important conversation, New Frontier of Journalism for Women, as part of its Newmark Civic Life Series, featuring pro-democracy conversations and lectures, thanks to a generous gift from Craig Newmark Philanthropies. This conversation is at the intersection of two of my passions, media and democracy. Throughout my career as a writer and producer, I have seen the news transform from print to online to social media platforms, podcasts, and beyond. That's why I'm looking forward to hearing insights from this next generation of journalists breaking new ground at such a critical moment in the US and around the world. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to introduce our moderator, Emily Tish Sussman. Like the panelists participating today, Emily has paved her own unique path in journalism. Emily is the host of the upcoming podcast Pivot, which will feature women, their stories, and how their pivot became their success. On her previous podcast, Your Political Playlist, she interviewed influential women, including Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, Stacey Abrams, and Yara Shahidi. In addition, she is a leading Democrat political strategist featured on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and CBS, and a women's rights advocate who helped shape the leading principles for the inaugural Women's March. Joining her today is an incredible lineup of news innovators, V. Spear, Naila Boodoo, and Emma Hinchliffe. You will hear more about them and from them in just a moment. Now, let's start the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and welcome to everyone online. I'm Emily Tish Sussman, host of the upcoming podcast Pivot, which interviews incredible women much like we have here today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 92nd Street Y's Newmark Civic Life Series, featuring pro-democracy lectures and conversations brought to you by the Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact. Critical to our democracy is the preservation of free press, and the conversation you're about to hear is with the next generation of journalists who are innovating in that space. Over the past few years, it seems like our trust and relationship with the news has fractured. With the rise of social media and the polarization of the news cycle, it's hard to break through it all and find trustworthy and accessible sources of news. But today, we're joined by three incredible journalists who have pioneered new forms of communicating the news to their audiences. They've each approached the gap in our news sources with an aim at changing the media landscape for the better. So joining us now is Emma Hinchliffe, who's the new editor and writer for Fortune magazine's The Broadsheet. She covers powerful women and the day's most important headlines. And Naila Boodoo, who is the host of the podcast Axios Today. She covers the biggest news of the day, plus stories you won't hear anywhere else. And finally, V. Spear, the host of the LA Times TikTok and Under the Desk News on TikTok that has amassed over 2 million followers and delivers key headlines every day with matter-of-fact delivery and a mindful approach to tough subjects. So thank you all for joining us for the New Frontier of Journalism for Women panel. So let's jump right in. Emma, I want to start with you. How do you think the broadsheet differs from more traditional forms of media, and what are the benefits?
Yeah, I think the broadsheet has a couple distinguishing factors. For those who don't know, it's a newsletter that has been around at Fortune for almost 7 or 8 years now, and it publishes 5 days a week straight into the inbox of our subscribers. We cover, the tagline is it's for and about the world's most powerful women, but really that means we're covering the news with a gender lens. So when, war breaks out in Ukraine, we're taking a look at who are the leaders in Europe who are women and who are dealing with this crisis. Or when there's, a Supreme Court nominee, we're looking at what does that mean for women? What milestones does this mark for our country, for our nation? And we really just follow the issues that involve women on the front lines of the news and that matter to women. And so we really reach subscribers direct in their inbox, which creates a sense of trust and authenticity and a really direct relationship between us at Fortune and at the Broadsheet and the folks who are reading us every morning.
Nyla, with Axios Today, you take a different approach by shortening the program. How do you think this helps the listeners better engage?
Right. So Axios is known for our smart brevity, which we did in newsletter format. And so I was tasked with doing that with our podcast, which is 2 years old. Will soon be 2 years old. And so we launched in June of 2020 with the really strict idea that we were going to give you a very clear sense of the news of the day in just 10 minutes. And so we covered 2 to 3 stories a day and try to go deep into those and create some understanding and nuance about it. But we are really strict about the time because I think people are busy. I think one of the mistakes we've made in journalism is I think there's sort of an arrogance to assuming that people have an hour or half an hour in the morning to listen to the news. And I think it's a mistake to think that people don't want to be informed just because they don't have the time. And so that's a big part of what we do on the podcast is that sort of like that's kind of, if I think about the contract that we established with our listeners is that we value their time and we spend all day working on those 10 minutes because sometimes people are like, well, you just do a 10 minute show. What do you do the rest of the day? I'm like, no, that takes all day because we're really trying to distill complex topics into something that's relatable and understandable in a way that people can understand. And I think it's really important to value people's time. And so that's how we try to establish that a sense of trust with our audience as well.
And V, the under the desk news segments are even shorter. What prompted you to create this series? And how do you see your reporting as different from other social media creators?
Yeah, so much like Nyla, who has a 10-minute program, I try to get everything in 60 seconds. And that takes the whole day, like she said. Growing up, I was very influenced by the way that my mother listened to me tell stories. And she used to have this saying, just tell me what happened, don't add to it, don't take anything away from it. And I've employed that tactic straight through to the way that I deliver stories today. I think it's important, again, for folks to kind of be able to have conversational notes on what's happening. Not everybody wants the deep dive. Not everybody wants the history. They want to be conversational. They're curious, but they also want to maybe not spend their whole day thinking about oftentimes the worst things happening in the world. So for me, it's about just telling what happened that day and not telling them necessarily what to think about it or what it means, allowing them, if they hear something they're curious about, to go and research it more deeply. Or if I get enough DMs and requests, I'll do a second follow-up on it with a little bit more info.
I think this is a great point, that just because people don't have all the time or they don't have access to all the outlets, it doesn't mean they don't want news. Right. They still want it. I like that you're all attacking it from a different angle. I mean, Emma, newsletters are becoming people's kind of morning coffee. Do you think it's a positive shift? Like, is the transition, how does this transition into this format? Because you're at a large media company, Fortune, inform the reporting.
Yeah, I think newsletters have been a big part of Fortune's strategy for several years now. But, I think it kind of goes alongside with what V is doing on social, what Axios is doing with podcasting and with smart brevity. I think newsletters, really add to a way to bring the news to you, because I think obviously it's great for folks to get news on TikTok while they're there. But I think a lot of people would think that, you shouldn't only be getting your news from TikTok if you are really interested and engaged and, want to understand what's happening in the world outside of the great information you're getting in 60 seconds from V. So I think newsletters really help to reach consumers who maybe are getting their news from social most of the time and are not opening the front page of a newspaper, going to the homepage of a site every single day. And it's a way to reach that news consumer directly in addition to social. In this case, it's where they already are when they're checking their email every day.
Right. So V, I actually want to build on this. You have incredible reach. The nature of the TikTok algorithm is to appeal to like-minded people, which also makes it an easy place for disinformation to spread. Do you find this to be true? And if so, how do you reach those who might need trustworthy news the most?
Yeah, so with TikTok, you can definitely get into niche TikTok where you're seeing a lot of the things that you already like over and over, a lot of the trends that you already like over and over. Where I have been intentional in growing my audience is in trying to pick stories that aren't one-sided. So I'm not only telling stories from a Democratic lens. I'm not only telling stories from a Republican lens. I'm not always trashing one side or the other. And in that way, I've built an audience that is pretty well 50-50, what we might consider traditionally conservative or liberal audience. In addition, a lot of folks have the misconception that it's a very young audience. It's not. 80% of TikTokers are between 16 and 34, and 60% are female. That's an incredibly valuable audience. Those folks are thoughtful, interested, great critical thinkers, and also want to go tell the story again to their friends and kind of loop more people in. So I think what I find in TikTok is you certainly can curate an audience that's just going to reaffirm every single thing you say if you want to have a hard bias. But more often than not, you're getting a really nice conversation between the folks that are coming together, especially in the space I've created on Under the Desk, which is, this is a calm space for news. This is a place to have a conversation, not a fight. And it's fun to listen to other people's side of things. It's fun to figure out, even if you think that they're completely wrong, why they're completely wrong or what led them to that. And I have a lot of folks who come in my DMs who will ask me to cross-check an article that is absolutely propaganda, and I'll tell them on both sides. And so they trust me and I trust them. And I think that's how you build an audience where disinformation isn't being spread, but where I'm constantly getting tagged. Hey, V, what did you think about this? Hey, V, what do you say? Like, hey, V, can you let us know if this is real? One of the most popular things I'm getting tagged in right now is misinformation, in particular as it relates to the situation in Ukraine, where folks are making viral videos with either old footage or they're staging things. It is still a performance-based TikTok, and it is still about getting likes and clicks and going viral. And there are some bad actors out there, but what I'll say about the TikTok audience is I think they pick up on that. I think they can see right through inauthenticity so much faster than, let's say, the Facebook audience can.
Oh, so that's interesting. You really distinguish between platforms. So when people ask your opinion about something, do you answer?
I do. And I'll tell them, I usually try to answer it in a way that's fostering a conversation. So if they ask me straight out what I think about something, let's say the trans rights bills that are being attacked in Texas, I'm going to give my honest answer. It's very clear that I would have an opinion on that as a trans person. Like, that would be something that I would have a strong feeling about. So I'll give them that one. But if it's something like, hey, what do you think about Ketanji Brown Jackson? I'm like, I think it's so interesting. Did you know that she did this? But I'm also curious about that. And then they start to get to tell me what they're curious about too. I don't want to be an authority for people. I think that's extremely dangerous, but I want to be somebody that they trust to like have a conversation or work their thoughts out in a way that they won't get bullied. They won't get told that they're dumb or they don't understand or you shouldn't think that way. It's like, maybe you should think that way. Let's think all the weird ways and then let's see where we end up at the end, you know?
And cultivating conversation across viewpoints and cultivating an audience that is neither taking one perspective or another is actually quite different than where news has gone. Like, I feel like you're presenting this as if it is the common, but it is not the common. I mean, for the last 10 years, I've been on cable news, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, across the board, and see how they have increasingly built towards their own audience, because that was where they continue to see engagement. So that's really interesting that you actually have built an audience with the opposite strategy of trying to have civil conversation. Because I don't think a bigger platform, I don't think they could do it. I mean, I guess that's why they didn't do it.
Well, I was going to say that's what we do at Axios. I mean, yes. I think it's the same thing. I mean, people reach out, our listeners can text me directly. And so I have conversations with different people who are listening to the podcast on a daily basis. And a lot of times they do text, and a lot of times people are, I think to V's point, they're looking for good sources of information. And I would say one of the number one texts I get from listeners is they say, I don't know what to say to this person who's saying this to me. And I'm trying to understand, like, I'm trying to talk to my elderly parents about vaccinations, and this person is saying this to them, and I know this is wrong. How do I find this information? But I think this is also I work for a new digital organization. So we don't have sort of the baggage of legacy news organizations that have ideologies attached to them or ascribed to them. And I do think that's also sort of the beauty of what people are looking for now, which is they're trying to find, I think there are a lot of people in America who are trying to find not partisan sources of information, but actually just want to know what's happening.
So as a reporter, you have had a career in radio and moved to podcasting. Do you feel like you have more flexibility in designing the way that you approach tough topics in podcasting versus radio?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's sort of the beauty. I mean, what I've always loved about audio is the intimacy that you have with your audience. And I think people, you're literally in people's ear and they don't see you. And I think people form an emotional attachment. And that's why people who are into podcasting love it so much, because I really do think there's something about your imagination being engaged that creates sort of an emotional attachment. And I mean, people listen to me every morning, right? So I think there are people who it's like their morning habit, like they're reading a morning newsletter, they're listening to me every morning. And I do think the joy of a podcast is creating that intimate space. And I think, look, it's been a really rough couple of years. I think it would be disingenuous for journalists to act like it hasn't been horrific and what we've all lived through. There's a humanity that we all should be introducing into our reporting. I think that's part of being a good journalist, is also just being an appropriate human. Like, we're not removed from the people we're talking to. We have all been living through a pandemic for the past 2.5 years. We are all now watching a war happen in Europe. I think those are all really tough things. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that. So, and I think that's what I think it's easier to do that on a podcast because it is less formal. V, I imagine it's the same thing because you're also doing this relationship with your audience.
And I get razzed all day about being a cheerleader because I am like optimistic and happy. And this is like, we're going to talk about scary things in a not scary way. And that's how I'm able to process things. And that's how a lot of folks who are listening are able to process them as well. I think there's not one way to do news. Like, sometimes I love to watch hard news because it gives me a break as a really empathetic, like, emotional person to be like, just tell me straight what happened. But when folks are on TikTok, they are scrolling between like trending videos and food and fun stuff. They're not necessarily ready to get hit with like Peter Jennings tonight. Like, they're not ready. So in some ways, you are building these relationships, and I've shown up authentically in that way, but you're looking back into that camera and I'm seeing 2 million people. I feel like I'm talking directly to them. And because they're in my house under my desk, I feel like a little bit more comfortable being a little bit more vulnerable with them and letting them see the side of me that's like, I'm a little scared too, and this is how I'm dealing with it. And I'm a little scared too, or I'm a little excited too, and this is why I'm excited about it. I think that helps people relate to the story in a way that's not necessarily like adding my opinion so much as adding my enthusiasm, or showing that we all hang up from whatever we're doing and tell our partners about it and cry about it or laugh about it or whatever the case may be. And that connection builds trust, but it has to be authentic. You have to be real about that, because I've seen some folks on TikTok too who try to kind of fake that. And again, the TikTok audience, they can see right through you. They are here to make friends. And if you're not a good friend, they're going to know right away.
So Emma, I want to talk about the gender lens that you bring to the Broadsheet and to bring to news in general. For the last couple of years, I hosted a political podcast where I had all women experts on. And in my mind, I was very specific that the reason to do that was because if I had a platform, I wanted to uplift these women that were not necessarily looking for the spotlight, but had absolute the expertise. But it was a show for everyone. It was not necessarily a show for women. And I also think that we need to be hearing women have wonky conversations if we're going to normalize women in power. So Emma, you do take a gender lens to the Broadsheet and a gender lens to news. And I will say, as a subscriber of the Broadsheet, I do get exposed to different kinds of news that I normally would, and I really enjoy it. Apparently, I only enjoy reading business news when women are at the center of it. So how do you think about it? Like, do you make news for women, for everyone? And do you think your audiences tend to trust women journalists more or less, or doesn't matter?
I think we definitely make news for everyone. And at least that's what we would like to be doing. I think sometimes, I think some men hear about the Broadsheet and they say, oh, that's not for me. Or if they do subscribe to the Broadsheet, if they tell me about it, it's always, oh, well, my wife is a woman in business, so I really wanted to subscribe, but now I actually like it and I learned something. It's always kind of an element of surprise, which, I think we should hopefully get to a point where that's not the immediate reaction to hearing about gender lens news, since this is something that lots of publications have taken on. I think Fortune is one of the most prominent publications doing this in the business space, but of course there's the 19th, the organization that does gender lens news in politics and policy. The New York Times has had a gender lens approach and a newsletter for a while. So, this isn't really unusual anymore, and it shouldn't be unusual. I don't want to be the only person doing this. But
Washington Post actually just shut theirs.
Yeah, I think it's still around. It's just kind of transitioning to be a little bit more integrated into the Post, if I remember that correctly.
Well, so do you think that audiences respond to women journalists as better reporters, more empathetic? Like in a written form, how do you find audience? Do you find the audience prefers women or men journalists?
I think in the newsletter context, I think audiences pay more attention to who's writing than they do when they're reading a byline on a piece on a website. And so in that case, I think the audience does know who I am. They know where I'm coming from. They know other folks who have written the broadsheet. They know who they are. And I don't know if they're responding to us because we're women, or if they're responding to us because of the issues we're talking about and the places we're choosing to put our attention. I think in the business space as well, obviously it's slightly different than general interest news. And I think it is more unusual to have a focus on women in, a very pure business context. And, I think when you're talking about women's representation across industries, we are Fortune magazine. So we're often talking about like the Fortune 500 and the number of women CEOs in the Fortune 500 and tracking that. And that's still an area where it is very unusual for a woman to be running a Fortune 500 company. So we really are thinking about, which stories we're presenting to our readers. But, I don't know if they trust us because we're women, but they definitely know where we're coming from and they trust that we are thinking about issues deeply and that we care about the same things that they care about.
So Nyla, women are often better at taking something complicated, distilling it, and then re-explaining it in a clear and concise way. How do you experience the differences in how women consume your content versus how men do?
Right. It's interesting because our podcast was created in part to bring more women into awareness of Axios because we were over indexing on more male readership of our newsletters. But the really interesting thing is I find that I get feedback from more men, which may not be surprising to people, right? I get a lot of feedback from more male listeners than female listeners. Although it's interesting because of when I ask I think now that my readers know that they can text me, now I'm starting to hear more from people who are just sort of sending like a hello, thank you for doing this every day. And I feel like that's kind of a pretty even split between men and women. I think that's what journalism is essentially journalism is explaining difficult concepts in a way that's relatable. I think that's what the best journalism is, right? And so I think that that's something that I feel like has always been a really important part of my career. And I think that it's something that I feel like most people who want to understand things would just appreciate that, like that you're trying to explain it to them in a relatable way. And so I think for us, what we try to do, we spend a lot of time, our team, which is actually mostly female, our production team is predominantly female on our producers and editors who work on the podcast on a daily basis. We just spend a lot of time talking about everything and talking through things and trying to distill that down. And we do it and we talk about everything with each other and then we talk about it with the reporter or whoever the guest is before we record. And I just think that's a really important part of trying to figure out how to do this in a smart, responsible, brief way.
That's a great point. I think with TikTok, the way that I'm approaching my male versus female audience, and I do have a 60-40 split, 60 female, 40 male, which is sort of unheard of. I was raised on Phil Donahue, Ricky Lake, and Sally Jesse Raphael. Like that was my version of growing up in the 80s with like working parents who were teenagers when they had me of journalism. And what I liked about that experience is my mom would be home with us, right? Like learning from Donahue about these really interesting topics, sometimes even very divisive topics. And then when my dad would come home, he would be very interested to hear from her what she learned from Donahue that day. He loved to like listen to that. So I think I had a unique growing up experience in which I modeled for me was my father, who was very interested in my mother's ideas. And he was very interested in learning about what she learned that day because he was in a factory line all day. And he was kind of excited to hear what Donahue said too. And so we would have this kind of conversation at the end of the night as to like what happened through the lens of my mother's experience of watching it on television. And that is very much the vibe that I bring to TikTok. And it's very much the feedback I get from the audience as well. I have women who feel very comfortable talking. My comments are full of chatter. Those folks have formed relationships. And then oftentimes with my male audience, they're more likely to not comment publicly, but to DM me or to say, oh, my wife sent me your TikToks. You seem really cool. I'm glad she's watching. It's like they trust me with their family. And I think that's a huge responsibility when you're performing the news or when you're interpreting things for folks, understanding that I'm here in New York living the life that I'm living, and some of my audience is in rural Arkansas watching my TikToks and then explaining it to their family and passing it on. And that's a huge responsibility. But I think it comes from a place of let's tell the best, most true story in the most interesting way so that you guys can take this information and relate it to your life and tell it in the way that you understood it, as opposed to us all just sitting looking at the television and deciding that only one person's point of view is worth hearing.
V, I want to stay with you on this. I mean, TikTok has a reputation for being a Gen Z dance app.
Yeah.
So how do you build your platform to be a trusted news source? And then what does a trusted audience look like? Like, how do you know when you feel like you have a trusted audience?
So like anything new, when TikTok first came out, of course, the kids were the first ones to have it. But right now, the gross majority of people on TikTok, and they do have, I pulled the numbers this morning, it's 138 million active users in the United States, 1 billion users overall. Only 32% of them are between 13 and 19. Everybody else is over that age. So the gross majority are much older. And it has become a place more for conversation than it has for dancing and trends, although you can loop yourself into a world in which that's all you ever see. So I think that's good to set first. And then just like with podcasts, just like with the radio in the 40s, just like anything else, people look at it and go, well, that's not real. That's not real news. That's not real. That's the children's dancing app. And some of that, I think, is because it's hard to learn something new. And if this is the new wave of what's popular or how to build audience, that could be scary if you haven't done that before, or if you put a lot of time and effort into different, more traditional media outlets. And there is, I mean, there's a Mean Girls Club everywhere, right? And there certainly is in this situation where some folks don't like the podcasters, some folks don't like the TikTokers, some people think that you shouldn't be able to just like walk on to an assignment because you have 2 million followers on TikTok. And all of that is just reflective of the society we live in. Things don't change that much, but 2 million people watching me every single day, that's an undeniably powerful outlet. And it's something that I do take as a responsibility. In the last 7 days, I've had 12 million views. I mean, I don't know if cable news has 12 million views on like a single episode, you know?
Well, so I can tell you they definitely don't.
They don't, yeah.
They definitely don't.
We have to take that seriously, though, and both as the person doing it and as the folks who are looking at new media and saying, okay, how do we fit this in to our channels? How do we give this more legitimacy? How do we get them better information? A good example of this is the White House briefing that just was parodied on Saturday Night Live for the White House inviting TikTokers to a briefing on Ukraine. Some folks thought that was incredible and a great way to reach out to folks who have big platforms, and other folks thought it was like kids on a dancing app and Drake meeting with Biden, and it like really wasn't that at all. In fact, I didn't think the White House was terribly prepared for the like intensity of Gen Z's questions, because they do not play. Gen Z is about to be the biggest living generation, and I am so proud of them. I think they're just the absolute coolest in the way that they don't believe you right away. You have to earn their love and their trust. And so they're the ones running TikTok and deciding what's in, what's out, what's true, what's false. And I trust them more than any other generation, honestly.
So Nyla, I want to keep this on the democracy piece, like on the strengthening democratic institutions. So how do you think new forms of communicating the news or supporting or harming the democratic institution that is the news?
I think the most important thing is knowledge and information in terms of when we're thinking about civic society, right? And we're seeing this firsthand. Like we're seeing this firsthand play out right now in Russia. Like we're looking at what happens to a society when they don't have access to information, and the cost of people who are standing up for that, like what that looks like, right? Like I was watching, I think maybe it was on TikTok, like a guy who was arrested for holding up a blank piece of paper in Russia and was arrested for just holding up a blank piece of paper, right? So I think that for me, I think the most essential part of a democracy is access to information and that free flow of information, because you need to have people who are informed about what's going on. And I think we know that the more informed people are, then the more engaged they are. And I think that's just sort of, that's the most important part of the role that I think journalists play in a democracy, is informing citizens, not influencing citizens, giving people information so they can make decisions about what they want to do with their lives. And I just think that is crucial. I think that I think we're in such a divisive moment in our society, like in our country, right? Like there's no denying that. There are people who are in these silos of the way that they're consuming information. But I will say, like, I have found my work over the podcast in the past 2 years to be incredibly gratifying because I hear from people across the political spectrum, across the country, mostly between the coasts who are listening. And they say the same thing that people told me when I was in public radio, which is we just want to know what's going on. Like we just want to have that information. And so I think it's easy sometimes for us to focus on the people who are the loudest, who are the most extreme, which probably are not the majority. And I think it's really important to remember that there are a lot of people who are just trying to figure out what's going on because they want to get through this pandemic. They want to keep their job. They want to keep their family safe. Like that's kind of, I mean, that's no different than what all of us want, right? And I think, well, that's, if we're thinking about those things, that's kind of like the important part of informing people because we're remembering what their priorities are while we're sort of engaging them in a democracy. And I think that's what, I think journalists are doing a better job of that. I think the 2016 election was a real wake-up call for a lot of people. But look, we're about to go through this again with the midterms. We're going to go through another presidential election cycle in 2 years. And there is an element of people who don't like, I mean, there's definitely people who don't want information. Like they don't want correct information. They do not want anything from anybody they perceive to be a journalist or the media. Like just by virtue, there is a percentage of the population, just by virtue of the fact that I am a journalist in Washington, D.C., they're like, I'm not going to listen to anything you say. And I get that, but I think that we should still be doing our jobs for the majority of Americans who are people who want to be engaged. And we see this with our numbers with the podcast. Just since the war has started, our numbers have gone up again in terms of our listening audience on a daily basis. That to me says like people want to know what's going on. Like they're looking for information. If people are consuming more news when news is happening, that should tell you everything you need to know about American society, not so much like the idea that people are consuming, how much people are consuming partisan news.
Well, I'm actually curious to know, when have you seen listenership drop? Like when are people not interested in getting more news?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, we saw so it was sort of like, remember there was like the Trump bump. Then there was kind of like the Trump, like, I guess you could say the opposite, like the Trump dump. So there was like kind of a period when, right? Like, so I think there was a period, and I think there was sort of a period after January 6th where we saw really intense interest, understandably. And then there was when people were just completely terrified and confused about what was going on in the direction of the country. Then we actually did have an inauguration and we did have a president, and Joe Biden started becoming the president. And I do think we had things kind of like leveled off a little in the summer. We also, we had that period last year, which, it seems like it was like 10 years ago at this point, but like there was that couple months period where there wasn't a lot of news. It was before the Delta variant. Everyone thought the pandemic was like, it was like this beautiful, like 2 months of not chaos. I think that's kind of when we saw like numbers drop off a little bit, unfortunately. And then, it's kind of ebbed and flowed. But I think, unfortunately, like, look, I would much rather that the world was less turbulent and less people were consuming news. But that's just kind of not the reality of where we are right now. And I do think the more chaotic the times, the more people are going to pay attention because they need to.
Right.
I think we have to be really careful with that too, though, because we see that on TikTok as well. And I would say like the fall of Afghanistan, I was doing reports almost 6-7 times a day because I have a very strong veteran population. And I ended up having to like switch from telling them what was happening in Afghanistan to giving them resources for mental health and stability. Because as I was feeling myself getting exhausted, they were as well. And I was getting DMs and messages that were very falling into despair. So you have to be very careful, because what can be really good for getting views and building your news can also be extremely dangerous for your audience. Because if they're getting too much too frequently, it just doesn't work and they won't trust you, and it just exhausts them overall. You get compassion fatigue. It's like anything else. You need a rise and release. There needs to be those times where your numbers aren't going up and nobody's listening, and that's okay. That's a good time to work on some of your more passion projects, I think. But you have to be responsible with not always having this like hockey stick growth in the way that your channel is performing.
And I mean, I think we think about that in terms of how we program the show on a daily basis. I mean, we always try And we actually have this discussion with the producers, or we have a fantastic staff that works on the podcast on a daily basis. And we're always talking about like, is this a fun story? What is like the fun story that we are obsessed with? Like, can we put a line in at the end of the show that's just sort of like a moment of hope or inspiration? Can we just create different, like, I think that's also the beauty of audio, is that sometimes you can just play something someone said and you get to hear them in their own words, and you just have 20 or 30 seconds of that and you can take that in. But I do think that's a really important point, as we think about how people, that's also, I think, I mean, for me, I was to say, as a journalist, like, I am very grateful for the fact that I'm producing a 10-minute show every day, and I'm not doing an hour or 2 hours or live on the air, because I think that's also a really taxing thing. You have to, first of all, you have to fill that time, but then also it's just a really taxing thing for you as a journalist to turn off from. And so I think, yeah, like, journalists get news fatigue too. So I think that's just something that we're all working on managing.
That has been so real. I mean, I have many friends who are in cable news, the cable news anchors, who have really, really had a tough time over the past couple of years living and projecting out. You know, I think it's both distilling what they felt like people needed to know, but also having to be seen, like having to be on when they were delivering it, I think has been extremely difficult. Yeah. And Emma, I want to bring you into this democracy, you know, news and democracy piece of this conversation. How do you feel like the role of new media outlets is the same or different than more legacy media outlets when it comes to this question of building democracy, protecting democracy?
Yeah, I think with the Broadsheet, we have an interesting insight into both of those because we are part of Fortune. And at the same time, the Broadsheet is a new product that is reaching readers and subscribers in new and different ways. And you can really see how readers respond differently to those kinds of organizations because, you know, we have some readers who subscribe to the Broadsheet and don't know that it's associated with Fortune. And we have some readers who subscribe to the Broadsheet because they love Fortune and they want to receive all Fortune products. So we really reach both kinds of readers in their inbox every day. And, you know, I think with the readers who are really attached to Fortune and to the 90-year-old Fortune brand, they come in with more expectations. You know, they know what a Fortune product is and they are there for that reason. And they want the Broadsheet to reflect what they expect from a business publication. And I think readers who are coming to the Broadsheet just for the Broadsheet, you know, are sometimes more open to different kinds of reporting, to different topic areas. And I think that's one reason we try to provide a lot of variety, you know, with what Bea and Neil were talking about in terms of that balance of, you know, very serious coverage and coverage that gives the journalist and the reader or listener a little bit of a break. You know, with the Broadsheet, we try to balance that as well, because, you know, when you're covering anything with a gender lens, anything with like an equity angle, you know, we don't live in an equal world. So a lot of times that coverage is not going to be positive and it's not going to reflect, you know, a bright and rosy reality. So, you know, we want to make sure that we are covering both, you know, we're covering issues like sexual harassment, we're covering issues like policy, the childcare disaster in this country. And at the same time, you know, we're spotlighting stories of, you know, successful female leadership, of the ways that, you know, the country and the world and the business world are improving when it comes to diversity and improving when it comes to equity as well.
I think something that's become incredibly clear over the last couple of weeks as we've seen the conflict in the Ukraine with Russia, that we really can't take democracy for granted. I think this became clear to a lot of us, you know, even more and more after the 2016 election, the 2020 election, January 6th, but we really can't assume it's going to be there, and we can't take our democracy, any democracy, for granted. So I imagine that a lot of our audience here has come today to this conversation because they're thinking about, you know, what do the platforms do, but what can I do? How can I be a part of this, especially when it comes to news, disinformation, creating good networks of trusted information? So I'd like to ask each of you, we'll start with you, Emma, how do you think each one of our listeners today can think about their role as a consumer of news and as a citizen in upholding democracy?
Yeah, you know, I think anyone who's watching this is probably very well informed and receives news in a lot of different ways, but maybe for other people in your life who are not yet doing that, I think, you know, just making sure that you are reading and understanding news from a variety of different sources, that you're understanding different perspectives, that you are hearing news from a gender lens if maybe all you do is go to the homepage of the Wall Street Journal every day, or not that the Wall Street Journal doesn't do great coverage of women's perspectives as well, because they do, but that you really are, an informed citizen, basically. I think as a journalist who, often, has to keep my opinions to myself, I think that is the most effective way that I feel like I can participate, by providing that different perspective. And I think that is a way for news consumers to do so as well.
Great, Nyla. I'd love to hear your opinion on how people can help protect the democracy.
I would say support journalists. It sounds really simple, but a lot of people don't want to pay for journalism, and I think that's a huge mistake. Like, where are you subscribing? Who are you supporting? I am fortunate to work in an organization where we don't charge. Like, the vast majority of Axios products are free. My podcast is free. But the way that you can support us is by sharing it with other people. And then our audience continues to grow. And we know that we will continue to be a financial success because our business model is based on advertising. And so I think that thinking about the sources that you trust and then supporting them are really important. And I will say, I think this is happening. Like, I have been a journalist for more than 20 years. And the past 2 or 3 years, like when I moved to Washington, D.C., I was like in line like a pandemic IKEA line where they were like social distanced, and I was in line for like 45 minutes. And so I started talking to the people in front of me. This is in suburban DC. And this woman said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a journalist." And she said, "Thank you." And I was like, the past 2 years, people have actually said thank you to me for being a journalist. That's never happened before. So I think people are doing that and recognize that. But I think it's important to be news literate and support that. And so when people are attacking journalists, it's important to say, like, that's not cool. Like, this is not okay. Even when people are making a joke about it, I'm like, journalists have gotten killed in this country because people don't take journalism seriously. Like, journalists don't just get killed like outside the US. Like, journalists are getting killed in this country. And so I think that's like an important thing for people to remember too, like, value the work that we do.
Yeah, V, I'd love to bring you in as well. What can people do?
Yes. So there's this conversation of what is journalism, who gets to be a journalism. And the First Amendment gives you the right to be a journalism. You could be a journalism, you could be a journalist, you could be journalistic, you could be whatever you want. 1A gives you that right. And we should fight for it and be just as excited about it as we are many of the other ones. So I would say be a really good neighbor, be a good citizen journalist, make a TikTok, like figure out how to talk to the furry community about voting rights, like their vote matters, talk about mom groups, talk about niche groups. You are going to have a skill and a perspective within you purely by the nature of the life that you've lived that makes you uniquely perfect to tell the story. Way better than me, way better than anybody else that you admire, maybe even. So I would say make a TikTok, be a citizen journalist, be a great neighbor. If you don't want to worry about world politics because that's too hard or you're not that interested in it, don't be interested in it. Be super interested in school boards, be super interested in what's going on right here when you walk out your door and you see what's around you. Care about the things that people you care about, because you're going to be the one to tell them the best story. And so that would be my advice for protecting democracy. And again, continuing to fight misinformation, continuing to fight partisanship, paid media, propaganda, all of that comes from sit around like my mom did in the 80s, listen to the Police Scanner and some Phil Donahue and figure out what you're going to tell your husband when he gets home or whatever or your wife or whoever, like that old school storytelling between neighbors. I think that's how we fight misinformation. That's how we fight infighting. That's how we really start to learn what's going on around us, because then we're not labeling ourselves first as, well, I'm a Democrat, I'm a woman, I'm 36 years old, and I have one child. Now I'm put so many labels on me. Well, what does that mean? What do you care about? Like, what's your story? How do you tell it to other people? Be a citizen journalist would be my advice to fight for democracy.
Well, one of the things that I worry about that you touched on a little bit is the lack of local papers.
Mm-hmm.
Because so much of the relationship with the outlet and with the journalist is because they can signal that they understand that they understand us as an audience. And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but the closing of local papers is crazy so quickly. And local news affiliates, which are still I believe the number one source of how people get news in the US, are being bought up by conglomerate news organizations that are then actually dictating what the local news organization should be putting on air. So that concerns me about having the locale. And quite frankly, I don't really have a very good answer for where it's going, but it does feel like a piece of it is people's reluctance to pay for news. So
Totally.
It then doesn't support it, but you seem ready.
What I would say about, the closing of local news is a huge deal. That's a big issue with silencing. I've described it as like, if broadcast media and the big newspapers are Broadway, then TikTok is community theater, right? And we all like to come watch a nice community theater production. So you have to pick up for those local newspapers. You have to pick up for the advocacy, Aaron Brockovich style, if you want to call it that way, for what's going on in your neighborhood. People will be interested in it. There are folks on TikTok that have niche accounts that do 60-second Boston news, 60-second rural Arkansas car news. People will watch you. They'll find you. So I think it's about rebuilding those networks. My grandma used to say skirts can only get so short before the maxi dress is back in. They can take away all the local newspapers, all the local news channels can get bought up. They can't stop you from telling stories truthfully. They can't stop you from building a community. And so I think that's where you can maybe anchor back into. It might take a little bit longer, might be a micro influence as opposed to a macro, but it makes a difference.
And I would say, I think that the death of local newspapers is well documented. Mm-hmm. I myself came from a local newspaper. I am a product of the Miami Herald, which was my hometown paper. And I think the important thing to note is there are a lot of companies that are expanding in local. Like my bosses would kill me if I did not point out Axios Local. Like we launched Axios Local last year, and I think we have 14 cities. We have 700,000 subscribers. We are hiring like crazy and opening in at least, I think, 10 more cities. And I think the plan is to be at least 50 by the end of the year. So I think there are a lot of local news organizations that maybe are not newspapers. And I think people just need to seek those out. Like there are great examples of local websites and newsletters that are thriving in a lot of cities across the country. And I think try to find those and support those, because I think there are quite a few people in the local space who are saying like, this is our community. We care about this. We want our local citizens to be informed. And there are a lot of startups out there in the local space. They are not the local newspaper. And like Axios Local is not trying to create it's not a local newspaper. We have 2 or 3 people in the cities that we're hiring. That's not the same as a local newspaper, but it is something. And I think look for other organizations that are doing things similarly, because there are a lot of those in a lot of towns across this country.
Emma, do you think the only future for local is digital? Like, are there other options, do you think, for getting local news?
I mean, I don't know. I think digital is obviously, where most coverage is these days. I do work for a publication that still has a print magazine that publishes 6 times a year, down from 12. But, there's something special about having that in your hands. But that's, more of an experience, more of a luxury product than a way to get your news every single day. But, I wouldn't say digital only. I'd say digital and social. That if you're considering that something slightly different from straight digital news. I'm also a local news alum. For me, it was the Bergen Record in New Jersey and the Houston Chronicle. So definitely am passionate about local newspapers as well. And so I agree, Nyla. I don't think I don't think these kind of new forms of local coverage replace the newspaper, but it's something. And, we've got to support the local newspapers we do have left.
Well, this is an excellent segue to the closing question that I want to ask each of you. And Emma, I'll stay with you to get your thoughts. So where do you think the next 5 years is going in terms of journalism? Where are we headed?
Yeah, I think for that, I'll stick with what we do at the Broadsheet and kind of the gender lens and how we think about gender lens news. I think it's been around for a while. And I think when it started, it was kind of a pure approach to, we cover women and we cover women's issues. And obviously over the past 10 years, that has really expanded. And I think we still talk about gender lens news, but it means something different than it did 10 years ago. It means more of like an equity angle to the news. And part of gender lens news is covering racial equity and covering LGBTQ plus communities and really taking a broad look at everyone in our society who is not represented in the mainstream headlines every single day. So for me at the Broadsheet and for us at Fortune, I think that's really continuing that and hopefully moving that gender lens more towards the mainstream. So we don't need specialty publications to do this coverage anymore. If it was part of the mainstream for every organization, that would be fantastic.
Great. V, where do you think we're heading? Tell us what kind of news we're going to be seeing on TikTok.
So I think if we look at where we were, right, that the idea of the news was to give you what is right, true, and singular, because oftentimes it was written just by men who decided what was right, true, and singular. I think where we're seeing journalism take a change now that's so exciting is that we're looking for something that's interesting, authentic, and diverse. There are many different points that are true of the same story. And so I think that's where journalism is going, to a more what is true for which group and in which way. And then outside of that, what's the big picture truth? But I think what's really fun is getting away from the notion of a singular truth and now having a diverse truth and what those implications are throughout.
Great. Nyla, where are we headed?
I would just say, to build on what both V and Emma said, I think for me, the diversity is the most exciting thing. We just passed the 1-year mark of the Atlanta spa shootings. And if you look at the change in the way news media and as a country, we have understood the AAPI experience and the Asian American experience, and the way that we talk about that has been a remarkable change in the past year of just understanding that Asian Americans and the Asian community in this country also faces racism, and this is what it looks like. And I think as someone who is an Asian American journalist, it's been really gratifying to see that, like, the association I've been a part of my whole career, AAJ, like, our website crashed a couple of times this year because so many people were trying to go to it. Like, that is an amazing thing. And I think it points to how important this conversation needs to be to continue, how important it is to continue to have diversity of the sources as well as the journalists. And I think for the first time, I'm very encouraged by, if we draw a line from the Black Lives Matter movement to, like, looking at how that influenced our coverage and understanding of the Atlanta spa shootings and where we go from here. I think it's the racial reckoning and the gender reckoning and all of that's happening within journalism is incredibly important, because it does allow people to bring their lived experience to their work and for that to be valued. And I think that's a huge part of continuing to be authentic and connect with our audience, is reflect that. And I would say reflect that in a lot of different ways, right? Like, I think the way that a lot of mainstream news organizations fall down is they're just on the coast. There's just people on those two coasts who are doing things. Like, we need to have more diversity between that and have local journalism thriving in every city and have people representing those voices. And so that's, to me, like, the most exciting thing. And what I would love to see is, like, best case outcome of the next 3 to 4 years is a continuing breadth of that diversity, and to see that deepen, and to think about, that's really exciting to me, to think about what our stories are going to look like and who we're going to talk to and who's going to be reflected in that over the next 5 years.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I could keep this conversation going all night long. It has been such a pleasure speaking with our incredible panelists. I am personal subscribers of each and every one of your news outlets and a huge fan of you all. So this has been really exciting for me to understand what goes behind the creation of all of it. And I will have a whole new appreciation for listening, which is a good reminder to all of our audience to subscribe to their podcast, their TikTok, their newsletters. There'll be more online. There'll be links in the description so you can follow everybody's news outlets. We'll share everything in the chat. And lastly, thank you to our audience so much for joining us for the 92nd Street Y's Newmark Civic Life Series from the Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact. I'm Emily Tish Sussman, host of the upcoming podcast Pivot, and this was our Future of Journalism for Women conversation. Thank you so much.